Going into game 8 of the Women's World Championship match, the champion, Wenjun, led by 3 points. In fact, she just won 3 games on the bounce. So could the challenger, Zhongyi, stop the rot? Let's take a look at this game. So Tan had white e4, e5, knight c3. So a Vienna, I mean, it's not the most testing opening. It's pretty solid. Well, it's solid if Wenjun wants it. And she wanted that. She played knight c6. Of course, there is no need to get involved in these kind of complications. That would be more Tan style. But knight c6, there's no need to rock the boat when you're 3 points clear, basically. And here, actually, white would love to play f4, but tactically it doesn't work because of this. Knight takes knight, d5. An old trick in these kind of king's pawn openings. So white has to play d3. And after that, bishop b4. And black is already fine here. I mean, this is an ancient variation. Black is fine because there's already a threat to break with d5. Tan played knight f3. And in fact, d5 is possible here already. But Zhu just played very solidly, d6, and then exchanged on c3. So it looks very much like a 4 knights actually, except you can see there's that typical pin, except that white's bishop is on c4 rather than b5. But that actually allows black a little maneuver. Okay, first of all, h6, of course, white does not want to release the tension like this. Bishop h4, knight a5. That's the point, that it's possible to exchange off that potentially dangerous bishop already. Now, I suppose, white can argue that this has slightly improved the structure. A pawn is closer to the middle and the rook is on a semi-open file, but it's not such a big deal. Queen e7 and rook e1 played. Okay, good to put the rook in the middle. And I mean, black's problem here is this pin. How do you break it? So one way is to go g5 straight away. But in that case, you have to always be a little bit careful of your king. I mean, this sacrifice also isn't out of the question. So I'm not surprised that Zhu declined to play like that. You could also play bishop g4. Don't think there's anything wrong with this. And after the exchange, then go g5. And this doesn't look so scary when there's no knight to hop in on f5. We've discussed this pawn structure quite a lot on the channel. So, there are various things that black could do here. Zhu played queen e6. Interesting idea. I mean, as I've mentioned before, in the 4 knights, you often see this idea of just stepping out of the pin like this. I mean, it's a little bit unusual when it blocks the bishop, but it's not such a big deal. But d4 played. Now, I think it would be better to leave this structure as is for the time being and maneuver this knight round. I think this is the best way for white to play. And then either via c4 and back into e3, looking at the outpost, on f5, potentially d5 as well, or maybe via f1 to e3. And black still has a few little problems to solve. I don't think it's a big deal, but I think that would be my preferred way of playing for white. But Tan played d4, just breaking in the centre straight away. But it's not such a big deal. The knight just dropped back. I think black would be very happy to see a move like d5, because then, after the queen moves, obviously, black can break with f5. Again, I think knight d2 is a reasonable move. But queen d3, okay, connects the rooks. a6, fine. Prepares later on to move the rook away from the a file, so there's no threat here. Rook d1. Okay, white's position looks very stable, very solid. You could say that white has a slight advantage with a little bit more space. However, black is very secure here, and the pressure's starting to build a little bit on the e4 pawn. b5. So preparing to bring perhaps the bishop to b7 to put a little more pressure here. And knight f6. So you can see these three pieces pointing at the pawn on e4. And it's difficult for white to sort of break here. I mean, Tan goes for b4. I think I might have gone d4, d5, and then pushed with c4. Although, I mean, it seems to me that black is absolutely fine. Black's position is very, very solid here. But b4 played after 19 minutes thought. Knight h5. Yep, looks very reasonable. It's not just about bagging that bishop, but actually it gives the queen a very nice square on g6. So somehow the pressure increases here. But also there's potential to break with f5. And I think when the queen is on the king side, then black's king can feel quite safe in this kind of position. So, for example, d5, not a good move, f5, and that bishop is about to come into the game. It looks really nice. By the way, that's the drawback of leaving these pawns here. You can see that pawn on c2 is potentially vulnerable. Okay, Tan exchanged on e5, an exchange on g3, and Tan declined to go into the endgame. I can understand why she didn't want to exchange queens, because I think it's quite an easy position for black to play. It looks about equal to me. f3 and the king comes up, but black is really solid there. Instead, she plays h takes g3, keeping the queens on the board. But I don't know, black's queen feels like it's in such a good position here that actually I think the queen exchange for white would have been more prudent. And this knight looks to me like it's sort of, in a cul-de-sac there. So rook e3 played, rook e8. So you can see pressure building very nicely. So you can see Drew's pieces here, really well coordinated. I mean, you could say the same about white's pieces, but somehow I prefer that bishop to the knight in this particular position. And indeed, f5 looks to bring the bishop on d7 into the game. Watch that pawn on c2. And this is where white has to be careful. Tan has somehow released the tension incorrectly in this position. This was the theme of one of my broadcasts the other day for my patrons. Releasing the tension too early, exchanging too early in the game. And it's clearly gone very right for black and not so well for white in this position. However, if white plays accurately, this position is still tenable. So Tan played queen d4. Mistake. Would have been better to exchange. Now there's going to be an exchange of pieces here. At the moment white is pawn down, but you can see this one is going to recover one of these pawns. Okay, the queen comes down, check. And basically this position is equal. I mean, it would be great if black could find a way to get the bishop here. But be careful, there's a check on e6. And if the king comes here, then queen e5, queen e7. Pawns are level. Pawns are equal. Material is equal. Should be a draw. But Tan played queen d4. I mean, she was looking to do this as well, but it's not quite as good, this version. Let's have a look. So a big exchange of rooks on e4, c4. Okay, she's trying to sort of gain some space for that pawn, but e3 is a really good move. Opening up the queen, and this is a really tricky position. So at the moment, let me see. Yeah, black is a pawn up. Tan goes for this one, but in this case, this is a really strong pass pawn. So everything is secure. This knight is really out of play at the edge of the board, and black is a pawn up. Very important that the queen is on this diagonal, actually. It means that the king can find a haven on h7, and there's going to be no check on this diagonal. So the king is safe. Now, if this knight can get back into the game successfully, that's a different story. But actually, everything is fine. So the queen stays on this diagonal, means the king is safe on h7. Now, this is a critical moment. Of course, Zhu had foreseen this position and realized that she could prevent the mate with queen d7. Now, it's possible to play knight e7. This wasn't played, but actually black is fine after this move. Remember, this is an extra pawn here, and a very dangerous pawn. Actually, after queen e8, defending against the mate on g8. Black should be winning, and the reason is this. It's a very annoying pin, actually. And white can't escape this successfully. So another pin. And then the pawn is ready to roll. So Tan exchanged on d7. And in this endgame of bishop against knight, this is pretty miserable. This pawn is just too strong. Pawn, I mean, material is now level, but with the pawn on c2, this is not good news. Now, the key thing is, can the king get into the game quickly? I mean, obviously, white would like to bring the king across and snap off that pawn. In the meantime, either the king has to come across to support this one, or when the king is across the other side of the board, you need to be able to attack these pawns. Now, both kings hurry across. First of all, bishop b5, of course, that's a threat, so knight c1. And it was at this moment that Zhu thought for half an hour. No, excuse me, she didn't think for half an hour. She put in a bit of a think here, not half an hour. No, I'm seeing the clock times and that half an hour is added to her clock. So she has enough time to think things through. And she would have done some calculation at this moment. I mean, first of all, h5, good move. That means that rather fixes these pawns. So g2 is a target. The king comes up the board. King d2. Wants to take this one off. But here's the key move, bishop f1. So if king takes pawn, then bishop takes. You want to take this pawn, and obviously this is g3 pawn is going to drop, and that's game over. The rook's pawn is too fast, too awkward for white. So knight b3 played instead, bishop g2 and knight d4. Okay, so is this a defense? The knight defends the pawn. The king for the moment is shut out. And it looks like white is going to take the c-pawn. Okay, so how does black win? Well, it didn't take Zhu too long just to work this one out. As I said, she had foreseen this position and calculated that actually bishop takes pawn is a winning sacrifice. Very neat, actually. But this was not guesswork. I can assure you. She had worked this out well in advance. Well, knights are notoriously poor at halting the advance of a rook's pawn, particularly when there's a king in attendance. And we can see that here. Knight f5 check. King g4, good move. So if knight takes g7, you can see that the king controls those squares. The knight simply can't get back. And if it comes here, you can see that even if it gets to d4, those squares are still controlled by the king. When this pawn is just going through. So knight e3 check played, king f3. Again, the king controls these key squares. If the knight comes here, then just g5 and then h4. Knight takes c2, h4, king g3. Again, that king doing a great job of controlling key squares. Well, f3 is the key square. Yeah, basically keeping the knight at arm's length as well. It can't hassle the king. The knight is very far away from being able to check the king. And then the h-pawn rolls down the board. And here Tan resigned. There's still a trick in this position, actually. So let me just continue very quickly and show you why Tan resigned this position, because, well, obviously the knight needs to give itself up for the rook's pawn. Now king e4. Now here is where it's possible to mess up. If you play g5, thinking, well, king f5, and then black's king comes across, well, in fact, this one doesn't do it. Let me show you. Now, king gets there. And I mean, it's possible to well, no, I mean, that's the basic idea. So after king e4, first of all, king g3. And if king f5, then you can see that now the king is too far away. So this is easy. And the pawn rolls through. Or if king d5, then the g-pawn advances. And of course, black gets there first. And, well, I hope you know your theory. When it's a knight's pawn, then this is winning for the queen. You basically force the king in front of the pawn and then bring the king over. Right. Let's leave the position there. So, Wenjun now has a 4-point lead in this match with just 4 games to go. She needs a half point from those remaining 4 games. I mean, this was a very disappointing game from Tan. Really, a complete collapse. She had a solid position from the opening. I mean, maybe it wasn't clear in her own mind what she was playing for. Was she playing for a slight advantage, hoping to sort of, grind something out? Or was she just thinking, I'm going to put up the shutters? Seemed to me she was confused in the way she played. By this point, she realised that things had gone wrong. I mean, I didn't like b4. That looks like a strange move to me. Anti-positional. Because it's harder to somehow get rid of that pawn on c2. And there's a hole here. So that looks like a strange decision to me. And this whole thing of exchanging on e5, black is clearly absolutely fine in this position. She just got a strategy quite wrong. Coming back here, that's got to be the way to go. Maneuvering the knight first before committing the pawns. And it might be that this pawn ends up on c4, which is a very nice pawn constellation. Or indeed, in this position, I mean, d4 isn't bad, but one could play knight d2 in this position. So she's really out of form. we've seen her play so much better than this. It's very unfortunate. But it happens. Her confidence is obviously absolutely at the bottom at the moment. It's very unfortunate, but we've often seen it in these World Championship matches, actually. It takes a lot to come back. There we go. I shall report back, but it looks like Wenjun is on the brink of retaining her world title.